The Arizona 120 exam is designed for architects and engineers who have extensive experience with SAP solutions and want to migrate or integrate them with Microsoft Azure. The exam covers how to plan and implement an infrastructure to support SAP workloads on Azure, how to design and implement high availability and disaster recovery, and how to maintain SAP workloads on Azure. The exam also requires knowledge of Azure administration, infrastructure as code, cloud infrastructure, security, and data protection. Candidates should have an Azure Administrator Associate certification before taking this exam. The passing score is 700 out of 1,000. 1. Which Azure service should you deploy for the approval process to meet the technical requirements? A. Just-in-time, JIT, VM access. B. Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, Identity Protection. C. Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, Privileged Identity Manager, PIM. D. Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, Conditional Access. 2. You plan to migrate an SAP environment to Azure. You need to recommend a solution to migrate the SAP application servers to Azure. The solution must minimize downtime and changes to the environments. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Storage Explorer. B. Azure Import, Export Service. C. As Copy. D. Azure Site Recovery. 3. You have an SAP landscape on Azure that uses SAP HANA. You perform a daily backup of HANA to Azure Blob Storage and retain copies of each backup for 1 year. You need to reduce the backup storage costs. What should you implement? A. A stored access policy. B. A recovery services vault backup policy. C. A storage access tier. 4. You have an on-premises SAP environment that uses X servers and IBM DB2 as the database platform. You plan to migrate SAP to Azure. In Azure, the SAP workloads will use Windows Server and Microsoft SQL Server as the database platform. What should you use to export from DB2 and import the data to SQL Server? AR3 Load. B. Azure SQL Data Warehouse. C. SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS. D. R3 Trans. 5. You have an SAP landscape on Azure. You deploy an SAP web dispatcher named Web1. You need to confirm that Web1 can support 1,500 users. What should you use? A. Apache JMeter. B. Lometer. C. ABAP Meter. D. FIO. 6. You deploy an SAP landscape on Azure. You plan to use an Azure automation account to stop the SAP virtual machines outside of business hours. You need to ensure that you can use Azure Automation Runbook A for the virtual machines. What does the Azure Automation account require? A. An Azure Storage account. B. An Azure App Service web job. C. A Recovery Services Vault. D. A Run As account. 7. You deploy an SAP environment on Azure. You need to ensure that incoming requests are distributed evenly across the application servers. What should you use? A. SAP Web Dispatcher. B. SAP Solution Manager. C. SAP Control. D. Azure M. 8. You have an on-premises third-party enterprise resource planning (ERP) system that uses Microsoft SQL Server 2016. You plan to migrate the ERP system to SAP Business Suite on SAP HANA on Azure Virtual Machines. You need to identify the appropriate sizing for Business Suite on HANA. What should you use? A. SAP Quick Sizer for HANA Cloud. B. SAP Cloud Platform Cockpit. C. HANA Cockpit. D. SAP Quick Sizer for HANA. 9. You have an on-premises SAP landscape and a hybrid Azure AD tenant. You plan to enable Azure AD authentication for SAP NetWeaver. What should you configure first in Azure AD? A. A conditional access policy. B. An Azure AD application proxy. C. A service principal. D. A user flow. 10. You have an on-premises SAP NetWeaver deployment that uses Windows Server 2016 and Microsoft SQL Server 2016. You need to migrate the deployment to an Azure virtual machine that runs Windows Server 2016 and has Microsoft SQL Server 2019 installed. Which migration method should you use? A. Heterogeneous SAP Classical Migration. B. Classical SAP Database Migration Option DMO. C. Lift and Shift. D. Azure Migrate.